I would like to begin a new series this morning, and the title of the series is Moses, a Very Human Leader. Moses, a Very Human Leader. You know, I think that when you hear this series, and I'm not really sure how long it's going to be, I'm just amassing a massive amount of information and studying and making notes. This series could last 4 weeks, it could last 4 months, I'm not sure. But I think that coming out of this series, what you're going to end up feeling and believing is this: God can use me. With my imperfections, with my inconsistencies, with my issues, with my stuff, God can use me. And I really believe you're going to believe that. And that's my prayer, that you will come out of this series believing that God can use you. If you will, turn in your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 34, and let's read together verses 10 through 12. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 through 12. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Well, I've never done a series on Moses before, so this is all new to me too, so I'm learning and discovering. But one of the things that you'll discover is that if you were to say, okay, I want to study Moses, there is this massive amount of biblical material related to his life. If you try to wrap your hands and mind around this man's life, you're going to end up getting thoroughly acquainted with the books of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, because he's all over the place in those books. The story of Moses is really a sequel to the life of Joseph. And you may remember the main components of Joseph's life. But just in case you don't know, or in case you need to be reminded, let me tell you a few of those things to set up the life of Moses. Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. Whenever you hear about the 12 tribes of Israel, each tribe was named after one of Jacob's sons. The problem is, Joseph was Jacob's favorite. And by the way, favoritism in families is always a disaster. And it certainly was a disaster in this case, because Jacob loved one of his sons so much, and it was so painfully clear to all of the other sons that he was the favorite that they resented him. They grew to literally hate him. And he was a constant reminder that they were just a notch below in the eyes of their father. And so what did they do? They sold him as a slave. So he ends up being transported to this nation called Egypt. Eventually, though, through the providence and sovereignty of God, what happens is that Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt. He interprets dreams because God enables him to have this supernatural ability to interpret dreams. And the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, needs to understand why he's dreaming what he's dreaming. And God gives Joseph this great ability to be able to interpret the man's dreams. And so he continues to be a trusted advisor in all of Egypt. In Exodus chapter 1, there is a verse that I want you to see. If you will, flip over to Exodus 1, 6 through 8. Exodus 1, 6 through 8. Now, before I read these, I want you to know this, that because of Joseph's position as prime minister, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, decided to allow all of Joseph's family to come to Egypt. It consisted of 70 people at the moment. But now, what I want you to see is Exodus 1, 6 through 8. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. So it began with 70 Israelites because Joseph is the man in Egypt. But now, approximately 400 years later, there are about 2 million Israelites living within the country of Egypt. Try to picture that. It's really important to understand that. There are about 2 million Israelites living in Egypt at the time. So now, Joseph, this man who was critical in the history of Egypt, is now a faint memory in the archives of the nation of Egypt. And so we now have a new king, a new Pharaoh, and he was a piece of work. Let me see if I can describe him. He was mentally unstable. He was paranoid. He was ruthless. He saw everyone as like plotting against him. And so he's looking out at his country and he sees that there are so many Israelites. And this is what he begins to rationalize. He begins to think, if a nation attacked Egypt, and if 2 million Israelites sided with the attackers of our nation, we would implode as a people. And so politically, he's thinking, I've got to get rid of these people. I've got to depopulate Egypt of Israelites. And so he goes on this all-out mission to get rid of as many Israelites as he possibly can. They threaten his dynasty. He is a man who is paranoid and he wants nothing to be a rival to his power. So he begins a policy of ethnic cleansing. But what he did not calculate is that he was now, by trying to squash the Israelites, he didn't calculate that he was going after God's people. And God took it very personally. And that the Israelites were the people of God. They were meant for God's glory. They were supposed to be free to serve God, to worship God, to sacrifice to God, to express their heart to God, to remember the promises that God had made to them as a nation through Abraham. They needed the freedom to do that, but Pharaoh definitely did not want that at all. And what I want you to see is that God takes it very personally when someone abuses his children. Let's look together at Exodus 2, 23 through 25. Exodus 2, 23 through 25. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Just for a moment, can I take a little bit of a side light here and just ask you the question, are you being mistreated? Is it possible that something is happening in your life and you're not being treated well? Maybe you're being abused. Maybe you're being mistreated in a way that is breaking your heart. Well, what I want you to know is that when you see this story, you're going to end up believing with all of your heart, God cares about it. He cares about me. And whenever I groan, he hears it. And whenever my heart breaks, he hears that. And he takes it incredibly seriously. Now, in the minds of the Israelites, God is doing nothing. He's passive. They're crying out to him, and he is taking forever to act. Do you ever feel that way? Do you ever feel like, God, I'm asking you to do this thing. I'm praying about this thing. I am begging you to answer this prayer, but it just seems like he's not responding at all. Well, that's what the Israelites felt like. They felt like God was not answering. He was not responding. They were groaning. They were crying. They were being mistreated. They were being abused by this maniacal, demonically induced man. And they just could not understand why God was not coming through for them. And so if you were to look at the life of Moses, you would probably divide it into 3 parts. And we would divide it into 40-year slices of his life. In the first 40 years, he is the prince of Egypt. In the second 40 years, he is the shepherd in Midian. In the third 40 years, he is the leader in Israel. Now, it's probably important for us to know that when you think about this man Moses, he is the most important figure in Judaism. He is respected greatly within Christianity. He is highly elevated within the religion of Islam. Moses is a man who is universally respected by people of religion. He's a critical figure. Everybody considers him to be a great leader. Everybody considers him to be this man that just has almost supernatural abilities and powers. But what I want you to see in this series is that there's really not an intelligible difference between him and you. And that the same God who empowered this man to do what he needed to do for his task will empower you to do what you need for your task. The same God of Moses who supernaturally enabled him to do what needed to be done will enable you to do what needs to be done. No matter what you're going through, and no matter how your heart is breaking, and no matter how you think it will never work out, God, the God of Moses, is with you. And so when you look at this man's life, you say, Moses had moments of glory and he had moments of disaster. Moses had moments of wonderfully walking with God, and yet he had feet of clay. There were times when he looked like the greatest leader in the world, and there were times that he looked like a puddle of mess. That's his life. There were times when he was filled with self-doubt. There were times when he felt insecure. There were times when he worked to the point of being burned out, and so he became physically and emotionally spent. Now, I will say this, that you have to admit that he had certain experiences that made him uniquely qualified to lead the nation of Israel, and we'll talk about that. But I just want you to see that God can use you, and that the God of Moses longs to use you in the same way. Now, this morning, what I would like to do is to take a completely different slant. And by the way, this just happened. I mean, I'm ransacking the Pentateuch. I'm ransacking these books in the Old Testament. I'm making massive amounts of notes of Moses, and then all of a sudden something occurs. It's like I wasn't planning on preaching on this at all. But something happened that was both interesting, intriguing, and I think you're going to be absolutely interested in what I saw. When you think about Moses, you end up realizing that he was shaped by women. Moses was a man who ultimately was shaped by women of strength. And this morning, what I would like to do is just simply name 5 women that if either one of those women had been extracted out of his life from a human standpoint, he would not have succeeded. As a matter of fact, if any of these women had been out of his life, he wouldn't have made it at all. As a matter of fact, he wouldn't have even lived if it had not been for some of these women. So let's talk about them. First, the midwives. Pharaoh's plot was to depopulate the nation of Egypt of the Israelites. And what he wanted to do is to abuse them and oppress them. Somehow he thought, if I put the clamps down, if I dishearten these people, then they're going to end up having fewer and fewer children. But he ended up discovering that this forced labor, this slavery, these taskmasters over the people of Israel did not break their hearts at all. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 12 says this: "So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly." And so here are God's people. They're under slavery. They are oppressed. They are being treated cruelly, but it didn't work. It did not work. And so here's this man in his palace, and he's trying to figure out, what do I do about these people? They're like ants, and raid is not getting rid of them. I've got to get rid of them. I've got to take care of these people. How do I do it? And so he came up with his next sinister plot. He had a meeting with the midwives, and he said to them, "This is now an edict from my office. Whenever you are called upon to deliver a baby of an Israelite, if the baby is a girl, she can live. If the baby is a boy, he has to die." Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine a man stooping that low? If you will, look at Exodus 1:17. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to see this, that if these women would have followed the edict of the most powerful man on the planet, Moses would have never been born. Can I say that again? If these women had obeyed the most powerful man on the planet, Moses would have never been born. So these women had incredible courage, and they defied Pharaoh. They were noble and they were strong, and they feared God more than they feared any man. And that is exactly what God is looking for today, whether it be among men or women. God is looking for men and women who fear God ultimately more than any other person in the world. In addition to their courage as midwives, they were very shrewd. As you can imagine, after they reject his edict, the word gets back to Pharaoh that, by the way, the midwives are not doing what you told them to do. There are Israelite boys being born. And so they are called into account. They're brought back before Pharaoh's presence. And I want you to hear Exodus chapter 1, verse 19 from a different translation. They answered, Hebrew women have their babies much quicker than Egyptian women. By the time we arrive, they are already born. Now, there are lots of explanations that theologians and philosophers have given down through the years about the response of the midwives to the Pharaoh. And it ultimately centers around the question, did they flat out lie? Now, let me give you 3 options that are possible. Option number 1 is that they were telling the exact truth. That God, during this time, supernaturally allowed Israelite women to have babies quickly so that by the time the midwife got there, the baby was already born. That's option number 1. Option number 2 is whenever the midwife heard that Sarah is getting ready to deliver her baby, she lives at like 36, Papyrus Lane. Go get her. Go to her right now. Well, the second option is that they looked at each other and said, let's go get a cup of coffee first. Let's take our time. So the second option is when they heard that someone was delivering a baby, they purposely waited and took their really good time in order to get there. But there's a third option, and I tend to believe that this may be the closest to the truth. So the midwives told the truth, at least half of it. They deceived Pharaoh, but it was their true observation that the Israelite women delivered quickly. So whenever they said the Israelite women delivered quickly, they were telling the absolute truth. Yet in their minds, and I think this is exactly what is happening, they thought that Pharaoh had forfeited any right to expect complete truthfulness or obedience because he gave a command to do something that God was diametrically opposed to, and that is killing babies. So I think that the truth is that these midwives had noticed that, boy, it just seems like Israelite ladies give birth quickly. And when they were called before the Pharaoh, they had to say something, and their something was, what can we do? They're already there when we get there. And so I want you to see that the midwives were women that if they had not had the courage to do what they did, I'm telling you, Moses would have never been born. But there's a second lady, Moses' mother, Jochebed. So Pharaoh is now outraged that the midwives did not do what he said. Through the providence of God, God lets them off the hook, and Pharaoh does not punish them. But he comes up with his now new phase of ethnic cleansing. He tells all of the nation that every boy that is born, you have to throw him into the river Nile. This guy's out of control. This guy's crazy. Every baby boy that is born, you got to throw him into the river Nile. So the Israelites' families are now horrified. There are these soldiers going all throughout the nation, and they are they are just waiting to hear about some boy being born, and they are going to jerk him away from the presence of his mother, and they are going to literally throw these babies into the river. And so, no doubt, the Nile, in the weeks following this edict, had newborn babies floating face down in the river. But Exodus chapter 2 and verse 2 says this, that Moses' mother Jochebed hid him for 3 months. Ladies and gentlemen, this was another courageous act. It was an act of defiance against the king. She could have been killed for this, but she hid him for 3 months. My guess is that after about 3 months, it became like increasingly difficult for her to hide him. You know, it was more difficult to keep him from crying in a way that he could be heard from people in the surrounding area. And so then what happens? Her creativity and her ingenuity kicks in. So carefully and cautiously, Jochebed tars this small basket. She makes it waterproof. She places her 3-month-old beautiful boy by the name of Moses in this basket because there's something that she knew. She knew that downriver, Pharaoh's daughter quite often bathed in the Nile. And so 3 months later, as she is bathing in the Nile, Jochebed puts her precious little baby in the basket, entrusting him into the hands of God. And I can just hear her prayer right now, Father, this is the only hope I have of my boy remaining alive. Please, Father, protect him. Do something that only you can do. I'm trusting you. I'm begging you, please protect my little boy. But during 3 months now, she has had time to think and to plan, and she's had time to go over the different scenarios that might develop. And in her heart of hearts, she's just thinking, when Amram, my husband, and I first laid eyes on this little boy, our hearts melted. And if there's any way that Pharaoh's daughter can just lay her eyes on our little boy, I think her heart's going to melt. And so she lets the basket go. And now here's a 3-month boy floating downriver. And just as she had hoped, Pharaoh's daughter spots him. A servant of Pharaoh's daughter takes him out of the water, hands the basket to Pharaoh's daughter. She pulls back the blanket, I'm assuming, and she sees this little boy who's crying his eyes out. Exodus 2:6 says, she felt sorry for him. She immediately recognized that he was a Hebrew boy. She immediately understood what was going on. Some desperate mother was trying to save her son. But there was something that was happening in her heart. And I think it was because of what God was doing in her heart. God was putting into her heart this great compassion for this boy. And in the plan of God, in the mighty plan of God, what God is doing is God is working out his plan through the emotions of the daughter of the man who had made the command that all Israelite boys be dead. Now, before we move to the next act in this story, I want you to see what the New Testament says about Moses' parents, Amram and Jochebed. Hebrews 11:23. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw that he was no ordinary child and that they were not afraid of the king's edict. So again, the parents, the mother, they're not afraid. Courage. Are you beginning to see that Moses was allowed to live because of strong women? He was allowed to flourish because of strong women. Who is the third person? The third person is Moses' sister, Miriam. So try to imagine this. For 3 months, Moses' mother, Jochebed, had to figure out a plan. Her hope was that once she let the basket down the Nile River, that Pharaoh's daughter would see him and would take him into her life and protect him. But she had to make sure. And so what did she do? She devised a plan whereby her daughter, Miriam, would approach Pharaoh's daughter as she is trying to figure out what to do with this little 3-month little boy that she just snatched out of the Nile River. And her daughter would whisper into Pharaoh's daughter's ear what she should do. Exodus 2:7. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" Now, there's a lot I want to say about this, but the first thing I want to say is Moses' older sister, it took guts for her to approach Pharaoh's daughter. It took backbone for her to do that. She was at great risk, but she was looking out for her baby brother. And she was doing everything within her power to try to protect him. And so here's what happens. It's ironic because Pharaoh's daughter says, "Why, what a splendid idea. That is just an awesome thing that you've proposed to me." And Miriam said, "I know just the lady." And so Miriam brought Jochebed, Moses' mother, who took her little boy and for the next several years reared him, nursed him. And so she had all of this protection, and Moses had all of the protection, and it was through the daughter of the man who was off his rocker, and it was because Miriam had the courage to approach her. Fourth, Pharaoh's daughter. Because of his relationship with Pharaoh's daughter, Moses became educated in Egypt. He was in the court. He was being prepared for nobility. He was someone who was given all of the opportunities in the world. Exodus 2:10 says it this way: "When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of water.'" So great care would have been taken to educate Moses, to teach him etiquette, to make him a well-rounded young man within the court of Pharaoh. Pharaoh's daughter would have probably been incredibly affectionate. She would have probably shared all of the skills that he would have needed to be a highly visible leader in Egypt. And so he had a lot of mentoring from this girl. He had a lot of mentoring from Pharaoh's daughter. Acts 7:22. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So our guess is that he learned math, he learned writing, he learned reading, he learned etiquette, he learned sports, he learned what it took to be a powerful man in Egypt. And then finally, the fifth person that we have to see, and she is almost this unknown figure in the Old Testament, it's Moses' wife, Zipporah. So before I begin to tell you about Zipporah, can I make this introductory statement? Sometimes God's leaders make big mistakes. Sometimes God's servants blow it. And sometimes God uses their wives to save their necks. And that's what happened here. It all began much earlier with the rite of circumcision. Circumcision was a surgery that would cut away flesh that could possibly hold disease in its folds. And this disease could theoretically be passed on to a wife without proper hygiene. And so this rite of circumcision became the symbol of the covenant of Israel. And it symbolized the need of the heart to be cleansed from sin's deadly disease. And so God commanded every Israelite boy to be circumcised as a sign of the covenant. And so here is Moses. Moses is a man that God is going to use beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He knows what needs to be done, but he didn't circumcise his boys. Why didn't he? I don't know. I think he got busy. I think the man was so consumed with life that he just didn't get around to it. But there's one thing that you have to know about God. He treats all of us equally. And if you're Moses and you mess up, you suffer the consequences. And so, listen to what happens in Exodus 4:24 through 26. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me, she said, so the Lord let him alone. At that time she said, bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. Do you see what's going on here? Again, Moses is saved by a woman. Again, Moses is saved by a strong woman. So, as a foundation of what we're going to be studying over the next however long, I want you to realize that if it had not been for the midwives, if it had not been for his mother, if it had not been for his sister, if it had not been for Pharaoh's daughter, if it had not been for his wife, if these women had not stepped up, been strong, been courageous, there would have been no Moses. And so as I close this message, what are the lessons that we can learn from all of this? Well, first of all, women play a huge role in the plan of God for the world. Huge. Secondly, wise men listen to women. Men who don't listen to women do it at their own peril. Thirdly, be on the lookout for what God wants to teach you through women. Fourthly, of all the places on the planet, women should be valued in the church. And then fifthly, in a culture where far too many women are ignored and abused, Christians should champion their cause. In the recent months, we've heard a lot of things about the mistreatment of women. We've heard a lot about the abuse of women. We've heard about the Me Too movement. We've heard a lot of things about women who have finally decided, you know what, I'm going to quit being silent. I'm going to tell my story. Good. Good. But if there's one thing that I want you to see in this message is that if it had not been for 5 courageous women, Moses would have never lived. And so what I would like to do is I would like to listen more closely to my wife. I would like to be more open to the lessons that God has to teach me through the women in this church. I would like for all of us to be able to understand that we may have moments of glory, but we also have feet of clay, and we have to have people praying for us and protecting us, or we're done for. Moses became Moses through the power of God, for sure, but through the courage of 5 strong women. Let's stand together as we close in prayer. Father, thank you for what you have revealed to us in your word about this man. And thank you for what you taught us, that if it had not been for courageous women stepping up and protecting him and defending him and going to bat for him, he would have never made it. Thank you for those women. I pray that the men of this church, myself included, would be more open, more teachable, and come even greater to the defense of women. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.